Don't talk to him. He's just our butler. My daughter-in-law humiliated me in front of 35 people at Thanksgiving. I replied, I think you're forgetting something. My son whispered, Don't embarrass us. I laughed out loud because the one paying for the rent and the credit cards made him learn the hard way. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Kent, and at 65 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of cruelty this world had to offer. I was wrong. It was Thanksgiving Day, and the house was buzzing with activity. 35 guests filled every corner of what everyone believed was my son Marcus's home. The dining room table stretched nearly the entire length of the room, adorned with my daughter-in-law Jessica's meticulously arranged centerpieces. Crystal glasses caught the afternoon light, and the smell of roasted turkey wafted from the kitchen where I'd been working since 5 in the morning. I was carrying a tray of appetizers to the living room when I heard Mrs. Henderson, one of Jessica's friends, call out to me, Kent, dear, how long have you been working for the family? Before I could answer, Jessica's voice cut through the air like a blade. She appeared beside me, her perfectly manicured hand reaching for the tray. Oh, don't bother talking to him, she said with a dismissive laugh that made my stomach clench. He's just our butler. Help is supposed to be invisible, not chatty. The words hit me like a physical blow. Around us, conversations quieted. I felt the weight of 35 pairs of eyes on me, some embarrassed, others curious about the family drama unfolding before them. Mrs. Henderson's face flushed red. I'm sorry, I didn't realize— No harm done, Jessica interrupted, her smile never wavering. Kent, why don't you go check on the kitchen? I'm sure there's something that needs your attention in there. I stood there, tray still in my hands, feeling heat creep up my neck. This wasn't the first time Jessica had treated me like hired help, but never in front of so many people. Never with such calculated cruelty. From across the room I caught sight of my son, Marcus. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw something flicker across his face. Embarrassment, maybe, but not for his wife's behavior. For me. He walked over, his jaw tight, and leaned close to my ear. Dad, please, he whispered, his breath hot against my cheek. Don't embarrass us. Just go along with it, okay? Those words cut deeper than Jessica's ever could. My own son, asking me to accept humiliation for the sake of appearances. I looked at him, this man I'd raised, and barely recognized the person staring back at me. But then, something unexpected happened. I started to laugh. It began as a quiet chuckle but grew louder until it filled the room. Heads turned, conversations stopped completely, and Jessica's confident smile faltered. Is something funny, Kent? She asked, her voice sharp with annoyance. I set the tray down on the nearest table and wiped my eyes. Oh, Jessica, I said, still chuckling. You have no idea how funny this actually is. Marcus grabbed my arm, his grip tighter than necessary. Dad, what are you doing? I looked around the room at all these people in their expensive clothes, eating food I'd prepared, in a house I'd paid for, drinking wine I'd bought. The irony was almost too much to bear. You know what's really amusing? I continued, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. Everyone here thinks they know the whole story, but they're missing some pretty important details. Jessica's face was beginning to pale. Kent, perhaps I should what? I interrupted. Go back to being invisible? Go back to pretending I'm just the help. The room was dead silent now. Even the children had stopped playing in the adjoining room, sensing the tension. I turned to address the guests directly. I think there's been a misunderstanding about my role in this household. Marcus stepped forward, panic flickering in his eyes. Dad, stop, please. But I was done stopping. Done being quiet. Done accepting treatment that no human being should have to endure, especially not from their own family. You see, I continued, my voice steady and clear, there's something Jessica forgot to mention when she introduced me as just the butler. I paused, letting the silence stretch. Jessica was gripping the back of a chair so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. What she forgot to tell you is exactly who's been paying for all of this. I gestured around the room. The house, the cars, the credit cards, the country club memberships, even this very dinner you're all enjoying. The color drained completely from Jessica's face. Mrs. Henderson looked confused, glancing between Jessica and me like she was watching a tennis match. I think, I said, straightening my shoulders and looking directly at my daughter-in-law. It's time everyone knew the truth about who really runs this household. The weight of those words hung in the air like smoke. Jessica opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Marcus was staring at me with a mixture of horror and something else I couldn't quite identify. For the first time in months, I felt truly alive. The humiliation that had been burning in my chest was transforming into something else entirely, something that felt remarkably like power. I could see the questions forming in the guests' minds, could practically hear the gears turning as they tried to piece together what I was really saying. Jessica's carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down, and for once, I was going to be the one holding the hammer. The next few minutes were going to change everything, and I was finally ready for it. I suppose I should explain how a 65-year-old man ends up being treated like hired help in his own son's house. The truth is, it wasn't always like this. And the house? Well, that's where the story gets interesting. It started 3 years ago when my wife Margaret passed away. We'd been married for 42 years, and losing her felt like losing half of myself. Margaret had always been the bridge between Marcus and me. After she died, that bridge crumbled, leaving us standing on opposite sides of a chasm neither of us knew how to cross. Marcus had been struggling financially for years. He'd started a small consulting business that never quite took off, and Jessica's spending habits didn't help matters. They were drowning in debt, facing foreclosure on their modest apartment, and Marcus was too proud to ask for help directly. But I'm not stupid. I could see the stress eating away at my son, the sleepless nights, the constant phone calls from creditors, the way Jessica's mood grew darker with each passing bill. So I made a decision that would change all our lives. You see, what none of them knew was that Margaret and I had been far more successful than we'd ever let on. We'd lived modestly by choice, not necessity. Margaret came from old money. Her grandfather had invested in railroads back when that meant something. When she passed, she left me everything. Combined with my own investments and the sale of the small manufacturing company I'd built from nothing, I found myself sitting on nearly $4 million. I could have simply written Marcus a check, but I wanted to do something more meaningful. So I bought this house, all 8 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, and 3 acres of prime real estate in the best neighborhood in town. Cost me $1.2 million cash. But here's the part that Jessica and Marcus don't know. I put the house in my name only. Legally, I own every brick, every beam, every blade of grass on this property. When I presented them with the keys, I told them it was an early inheritance, that I'd signed it over to them completely. I lied. I also didn't tell them about the monthly payments I've been making on their behalf. The $4,000 mortgage payment that doesn't exist because I paid cash, that money comes from me. The $600 car payments for both their vehicles, me again. The credit cards they use so freely, running up thousands of dollars each month on clothes, restaurants, and Jessica's endless shopping sprees. All of it flows through accounts I control. I've been funneling approximately $8,000 a month into their lifestyle, and they have no idea. They think Marcus's business suddenly became profitable. They think they finally made it. The irony is crushing. I became their anonymous benefactor, wanting to help without injuring Marcus's pride. Instead, I ended up enabling the very behavior that would ultimately humiliate me. It was Jessica's idea that I move in with them. Kent needs family around him, she'd said to Marcus, her voice dripping with false concern. He shouldn't be alone in that big house. Of course, she was referring to the house I'd actually sold to fund their new lifestyle, the one I'd claimed to be moving out of due to financial difficulties. At first, I thought it might be nice, spending time with my son, getting to know my daughter-in-law better, maybe even being around for grandchildren someday. But Jessica had different plans. Within a month of moving in, she'd established new rules. I was to handle the cooking and cleaning. Since you're living here rent-free, she'd explained, it only makes sense that you contribute somehow. Marcus nodded along, probably grateful that someone was managing the household tasks he'd never been good at. Rent-free, in my own house. Then came the uniform. Jessica bought me a set of black pants and white shirts, claiming it would be easier for entertaining if I looked professional. When guests came over, I was introduced as household staff, or our help. Never as Marcus's father, never as family. The boundaries grew more rigid with each passing month. I ate in the kitchen, not the dining room. I had my own entrance through the back door. My bedroom was in the basement, while the guest rooms upstairs remained for actual visitors. Marcus watched it happen and said nothing. Maybe he convinced himself that I was happy with the arrangement. Maybe he was just relieved that his domestic problems were being handled by someone else. Or maybe, and this hurts the most to admit, he was simply ashamed of his father. But here's what none of them understood. I could have stopped it at any time. With a single phone call to my bank, I could have cut off every payment, reclaimed the house, and left them scrambling to figure out how they'd maintain their new lifestyle. I didn't, because I kept hoping things would change. I kept believing that Marcus would remember who I was, that Jessica would show some basic human decency, that we could somehow become a real family. Instead, they grew more comfortable with the lie. Jessica started referring to me as our butler, even when we were alone. She'd leave lists of chores for me to complete, criticize my cooking if it wasn't up to her standards, and make it clear that my presence was tolerated but not appreciated. The final insult came 2 weeks ago when I overheard her on the phone with her mother. "Oh, Kent's not really a problem," she was saying, her voice casual and dismissive. "He keeps the house running, and honestly, free labor is free labor." Marcus feels bad about it sometimes, but I remind him that it's not like his father has anywhere else to go. Nowhere else to go. As if I were some charity case they'd graciously taken in. That's when I realized that my grand gesture of love had created something monstrous. In trying to help my son without damaging his pride, I'd accidentally given him permission to forget that I was his father. But today, watching Jessica humiliate me in front of 35 people, seeing Marcus choose her embarrassment over my dignity, I finally understood something crucial. They don't know who they're dealing with. They have no idea that the butler they've been dismissing holds all the cards, every comfort they enjoy, every luxury they take for granted, every aspect of the life they've built. It all depends on the man they just publicly humiliated. And now, standing in this room full of shocked faces, I was finally ready to play my hand. The game was about to change, and this time, I was going to make sure everyone knew exactly who was in control. After the Thanksgiving disaster, I decided it was time to really pay attention to what was happening in my own house. For months, I'd been moving through the daily routines like a ghost, focusing on cooking and cleaning while willfully ignoring the conversations happening around me. But humiliation has a way of sharpening your senses. The first thing I noticed was how Jessica talked about me when she thought I couldn't hear. I developed a habit of moving quietly through the house. Years of being treated like furniture will do that to you. And it turned out to be quite an advantage. 3 days after Thanksgiving, while I was organizing the pantry, I heard Jessica on the phone in the living room. Her voice carried that particular tone she used when she was feeling superior. "Oh, you should have seen Kent's face," she was saying, presumably to one of her friends. "He actually thought he could embarrass Marcus and me in front of our guests. Can you imagine? A grown man living off his son's charity, trying to cause drama, living off his son's charity." I gripped the can of tomatoes in my hand so tightly I thought it might burst. No. Marcus handled it perfectly," she continued. "He took his father aside and made it very clear that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated. Kent's been much quieter since then." And that conversation told me 2 things. Jessica was completely rewriting history to make herself the victim, and Marcus was apparently taking credit for handling me. Neither of them seemed to understand that I'd stopped talking, not because I'd been chastened, but because I was planning. But the real revelation came a week later when I discovered what Jessica had been telling my grandchildren. Marcus's sister Linda had 2 kids, 8-year-old Emma and 10-year-old Jake, who used to visit regularly. They'd always called me Grandpa Kent, would run to hug me when they arrived, and genuinely seemed to enjoy spending time with me. But over the past few months, their behavior had changed dramatically. They'd stopped seeking me out, would barely make eye contact when I served them meals, and seemed almost afraid to talk to me. I'd assumed it was just a phase, but then I overheard Emma talking to her mother on the phone. "Mommy, do we have to come to Uncle Marcus's house this weekend?" Emma was asking, her voice small and worried. "The man who works there scares me." "The man who works there?" My own granddaughter was referring to me as the man who works there. I stood frozen in the hallway listening as Emma continued. "Aunt Jessica says he gets angry sometimes and might try to trick us into thinking he's our real grandpa. She says some old people get confused and think they're part of families they don't belong to." The cruelty of it took my breath away. Jessica hadn't just been content to humiliate me in front of strangers. She'd been systematically poisoning my relationship with my grandchildren, making them afraid of me, convincing them that I was some delusional employee rather than their grandfather. That night, I called Linda directly. "Kent?" Her voice was surprised. "Is everything okay? You sound upset." "Linda, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." What has Jessica told you about my living situation here? There was a long pause. Well, she said you were having some financial difficulties after Mom died, and that you've been helping around the house in exchange for a place to stay. She mentioned that you sometimes get confused about your role in the family. Confused about my role in the family. Jessica had painted me as a senile old man who couldn't accept reality. Has she said anything else? About me specifically? Another pause. Longer this time. Kent, she's concerned about you. She thinks you might be developing some kind of dementia, that you sometimes forget you're not actually living in your own house anymore. I closed my eyes, feeling the full scope of Jessica's manipulation. She hadn't just been humiliating me for sport. She'd been building a case, creating a narrative that would justify whatever she was planning to do next. Linda, I said carefully, I want you to bring the kids over this Saturday. Just for a few hours. There are some things I need to straighten out. I don't know, Kent. Jessica specifically asked me not to encourage the children to what? Oh, to think of you as their grandfather. She said it was confusing for them since you're not really family anymore. Not really family anymore. The words hit me like a physical blow. After I hung up, I sat in my basement bedroom and tried to piece together Jessica's endgame. She'd isolated me from the grandchildren, convinced my own daughter-in-law that I was mentally unstable, and was apparently working on some larger plan to remove me from the picture entirely. The next day, I found out exactly what that plan was. I was dusting the upstairs hallway when I heard Jessica and Marcus having what they clearly thought was a private conversation in their bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and their voices carried easily. I've been researching facilities, Jessica was saying. There are some really nice assisted living places about an hour away, far enough that he couldn't just show up here whenever he wanted. I don't know, Jess, Marcus replied, his voice uncertain. Dad doesn't need assisted living. He's perfectly capable of taking care of himself. Is he, though? Jessica's voice took on that persuasive tone she used when she was manipulating him. Marcus, think about it. The confusion, the outbursts, the way he sometimes talks, like he owns things that clearly belong to us. These are all signs. Signs of what? Early dementia, maybe Alzheimer's, and it's only going to get worse. There was a long silence. Then Marcus spoke again, his voice weaker than before. But what if you're wrong? What if he's just adjusting to Mom being gone? Honey, Jessica said, and I could practically hear her stroking his arm. I know this is hard, but we have to think about our future. What happens when we want to start a family? Do you really want our children growing up around someone who's mentally unstable? Our children. They were planning to have kids, and Jessica was making sure I wouldn't be part of that picture. The place I found is actually quite nice, she continued. It's called Sunset Manor, and they specialize in cases like your father's. The monthly fee is only $3,000, which honestly isn't that much considering what we'd save on groceries and utilities with him gone. $3,000 a month. They were planning to ship me off to some facility and somehow expected to afford it on Marcus's supposedly successful business income. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. I already spoke with Dr. Martinez about getting the paperwork started, Jessica added. He said that with the right documentation, we could probably have your father placed within the month. My legs nearly gave out. They weren't just planning to get rid of me. They were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent and institutionalized against my will. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my basement bedroom, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what I'd learned. Jessica hadn't just been cruel for cruelty's sake. Every humiliation, every dismissal, every time she'd treated me like hired help, she'd been building toward this moment. She wanted me gone, and she'd convinced my son that it was for my own good. But what Jessica didn't know was that I'd been keeping detailed records of everything. Every payment I'd made on their behalf, every bill I'd covered, every expense I'd absorbed. I had bank statements, canceled checks, and documentation going back 3 years. More importantly, I had the deed to the house. The real deed, with my name on it as the sole owner. Jessica thought she was playing chess while I was playing checkers. She had no idea that I'd been watching, learning, and preparing for exactly this kind of betrayal. The next morning, I made a phone call to my lawyer, Harold Brennan. We'd known each other for 20 years, and he'd handled Margaret's estate. Harold, I said, keeping my voice low, I need to see you as soon as possible. And I need you to prepare some documents for me. What kind of documents, Kent? I looked around the house that everyone believed belonged to my son, thought about the grandchildren who'd been taught to fear me, and felt something cold and determined settle in my chest. The kind that are going to remind some people exactly who they're dealing with. It was time to stop being the victim and start being the man who held all the power. Jessica wanted to play games? Fine. But she was about to learn that some games have consequences she never saw coming. Harold Brennan's office hadn't changed much in the 20 years I'd known him. The same mahogany desk, the same leather-bound law books lining the walls, the same reassuring smell of old paper and coffee. But sitting across from him that Friday morning, I felt like a completely different person than the man who'd first walked through those doors. "Kent," Harold said, adjusting his reading glasses as he reviewed the documents I'd brought. "I have to ask, are you absolutely certain about this course of action?" I leaned back in the familiar chair and considered his question. Was I certain? 3 weeks ago, I would have said no. 3 weeks ago, I was still holding on to the hope that my family might remember I was more than just free labor. But that was before I learned about Jessica's plan to have me declared incompetent and shipped off to Sunset Manor. "Harold, in your professional opinion, what would happen if someone tried to have a competent adult declared mentally unfit for their own financial gain?" He raised an eyebrow. "That would constitute elder abuse, potentially fraud, and depending on the circumstances, could result in criminal charges. And if that same person was living in a house they didn't own, spending money they didn't earn, all while systematically isolating the actual owner from his family." Harold set down his glasses and looked at me directly. "Kent, what exactly is going on in that house?" I told him everything. The financial arrangements I'd hidden, Jessica's treatment of me, the lies she'd told the grandchildren, and most importantly, her plan to have me institutionalized. Harold's expression grew darker with each detail. "You're telling me that you own the house outright? You've been funding their entire lifestyle and they're planning to have you committed?" he asked. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." He was quiet for a long moment, then opened his desk drawer and pulled out a legal pad. "What do you want to do about it?" That was the question, wasn't it? I could have simply revealed the truth, shown them the financial records, and reclaimed my position as head of the household. But after months of humiliation, after learning that my own son was complicit in planning to institutionalize me, I wanted something more. "I want them to understand what they've really lost," I said. "Not just the money, but the man they chose to discard." Harold nodded slowly. "I can work with that. The plan we developed was elegant in its simplicity. First, we would quietly transfer the house deed into a trust with me as the sole beneficiary, making it impossible for anyone to claim ownership or make decisions about the property without my consent. Then, we would systematically withdraw my financial support in a way that would appear to be external circumstances, rather than my direct action. The beauty of this approach," Harold explained, "is that it gives them the opportunity to show their true character. When they think you have no power, no resources, and no options, how will they treat you then?" It was a test I wasn't sure I wanted the answer to, but I knew I needed to know. The first phase began the following Monday. I called my bank and instructed them to stop all automatic payments related to Marcus and Jessica's expenses. No more mortgage payments, car payments, or credit card bills. The accounts would simply appear to have insufficient funds. Within 48 hours, the first notices started arriving. I was in the kitchen Wednesday morning when the mail came. Jessica snatched up the pile before I could see it, but her face went pale as she flipped through the envelopes. "Marcus," she called, her voice sharp with panic. "We need to talk. Now." They disappeared into their bedroom, and I could hear the urgent whisper of their conversation through the walls. A few minutes later, Marcus emerged, looking confused and worried. "Dad," he said, finding me in the kitchen, "did you happen to see the mail today?" "No," I replied, continuing to chop vegetables for dinner. "Why?" "We're having some issues with our bank. Apparently, there's been some kind of computer error with our automatic payments." Computer error. I had to admire Jessica's ability to spin even bank notices into something that wasn't their fault. "That sounds frustrating," I said neutrally. "Yeah, well, we'll get it sorted out." But Marcus didn't look confident. "In the meantime, things might be a little tight around here. We might need to cut back on some expenses." I looked up from my vegetables. "What kind of expenses?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Well, things like groceries, utilities, that sort of thing. Nothing major, just temporary. The implication was clear. I would be expected to contribute financially to cover their temporary shortfall. If I'd had any doubt about their true feelings toward me, this conversation eliminated it. The moment they faced financial pressure, their first instinct was to extract money from the butler. I understand, I said simply, then returned to my cooking. Over the next week, more notices arrived. The mortgage company, both car loan providers, and several credit card companies. Jessica's panic grew more pronounced each day, though she tried to hide it behind increasingly frantic phone calls to the bank. "This is ridiculous," I heard her telling someone, probably her mother. "We've never missed a payment in our lives. There must be some kind of systemic error," but the bank's records were correct. There was no error. There was simply no money coming from the accounts I'd been funding. By Friday, Jessica's mask was beginning to slip. She snapped at me for minor things, leaving a water glass on the counter, not folding the towels exactly the way she preferred. When I didn't react to her increased hostility, she seemed to grow even more frustrated. That evening, I overheard another conversation between her and Marcus. "We can't keep pretending this is a bank error," Marcus was saying. "These are real bills, and we don't have the money to pay them." "Well, what do you suggest?" Jessica's voice was tighter than I'd ever heard it. "Ask your father for a loan? He's been living here rent-free for 2 years. He should be helping us anyway." "I can't ask my dad for money, Jess. He's on a fixed income." "Fixed income, if only he knew." "Then what?" Jessica's voice was rising now. "Do you want to lose the house, the cars, everything we've worked for? Maybe we could refinance. Or I could take on more clients." "Marcus, you're not listening. We need cash now, today, and your father is the only option we have." There was a long silence. Then Marcus spoke again, his voice reluctant. "How much do you think we should ask for?" "Start small, maybe $5,000. Tell him it's just temporary, that we'll pay him back as soon as the bank sorts out this mess." $5,000. They wanted me to loan them $5,000 to cover bills I'd been paying all along. The audacity of it was almost impressive, but the most revealing part of the conversation was what came next. "What if he says no?" Marcus asked. Jessica's laugh was cold and calculating. "He won't say no. Where else is he going to go? He needs us more than we need him. Where else was I going to go? As if I were some stray dog they'd taken in out of pity. Besides," she continued, "if he doesn't help, we could always move forward with the Sunset Manor plan. Dr. Martinez said the paperwork is almost ready." My hands clenched into fists. They were planning to use my institutionalization as leverage to extort money from me. The next morning, Marcus approached me with the request, exactly as Jessica had coached him. His manner was awkward, apologetic, but there was an underlying assumption that I would comply. "Dad, I hate to ask this, but we're in a temporary bind. Just until we get this banking situation resolved, could you possibly loan us some money?" I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and supported and loved unconditionally, and felt something cold settle in my chest. "How much money?" I asked. $5,000. I know it's a lot, but we wouldn't ask if we had any other choice." I pretended to consider it, watching the hope and desperation war across his features. "I'm sorry, Marcus," I said finally. "I don't have that kind of money available." His face fell. "Are you sure? Maybe you could check your savings or—" "Son, I'm living on Social Security and whatever small pension I have left. $5,000 might as well be $50,000. It was a lie, of course, but Marcus didn't know that. He nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. I understand. It was worth asking, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't understand. Not really. He was already thinking about how to explain to Jessica that her plan had failed. That afternoon I heard them arguing again. "He said no?" Jessica's voice was incredulous. "He doesn't have the money, Jess. We can't ask someone for something they don't have." "Bullshit. He's just being selfish, after everything we've done for him. Everything they'd done for me." The woman who'd been planning to institutionalize me was upset that I wouldn't fund her lifestyle. "Maybe we should reconsider the Sunset Manor option," she continued. "If he's not going to contribute financially, what's the point of keeping him here?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice so low I had to strain to hear it, he said, "Maybe you're right. Maybe you're right. My own son had just agreed that I should be shipped off to an institution because I wouldn't give them money I didn't supposedly have." That night, I called Harold again. "How's the experiment going?" he asked. "About as expected," I replied. "They've asked for money, and when I said no, they started discussing institutionalization as punishment." "Jesus, Kent, I'm sorry." "Don't be. This is exactly what I needed to know." "What's the next phase?" I looked around the basement room where I'd been relegated, thought about the grandchildren who'd been taught to fear me, and made my decision. It's time to show them who really owns this house. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. I'd planned to let them stew in their financial crisis for another week, maybe 2, before revealing the truth. But Jessica forced my hand. It was a Tuesday morning when I heard her on the phone with Dr. Martinez discussing my deteriorating mental state and the urgency of getting me placed at Sunset Manor before I became a danger to myself or others. A danger to myself or others. The woman was actually building a case for emergency psychiatric commitment. "Yes, doctor," she was saying, her voice taking on that syrupy, concerned tone she used when manipulating people. "He's been increasingly agitated since we told him about our financial problems. Yesterday he actually laughed when Marcus explained we might lose the house. It was very disturbing." I had laughed, but not for the reasons she was implying. The idea that they might lose a house they'd never owned in the first place was genuinely amusing. "Of course I'm concerned for everyone's safety," she continued. "That's why I think the emergency placement option might be our best choice. How quickly could we have him transferred?" Emergency placement. They wanted to have me committed within days, not weeks. I'd heard enough. It was time to end this charade. That evening, I asked Marcus and Jessica to join me in the living room for a family meeting. They exchanged glances, probably assuming I was going to offer them money or apologize for my recent behavior. "There's something I need to discuss with both of you," I said, settling into the armchair that had always been mine, though they'd never acknowledged it. Jessica perched on the edge of the sofa, her body language suggesting she was ready to flee if I became agitated. Marcus sat beside her, looking tired and defeated. "I know you've been having financial difficulties," I began. Marcus straightened slightly. "Dad, if this is about the loan we asked for..." "It's not about the loan." I kept my voice calm, measured. "It's about something much more important than $5,000. Jessica crossed her arms. "Kent, if you're going to lecture us about financial responsibility..." "I'm going to tell you the truth," I interrupted. "Something I should have done a long time ago." I reached into the folder I'd placed beside my chair and pulled out the first document, the deed to the house, with my name clearly listed as the sole owner. "This is the deed to this house," I said, setting it on the coffee table between us. "As you can see, my name is on it. Only my name." Marcus leaned forward, squinting at the document. "I don't understand. You said you'd signed the house over to us." "No, Marcus. I said it was an early inheritance. I never said I'd actually transferred ownership." Jessica's face was beginning to pale. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I own this house. Completely and entirely. You've been living in my property for 3 years. The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically see the gears turning in their minds as they tried to process this information. "But the mortgage payments," Marcus started. "There are no mortgage payments." I pulled out the next set of documents. "I bought this house with cash, $1.2 million to be exact." Jessica's mouth fell open. "That's impossible. You don't have that kind of money." I smiled, pulling out my latest bank statement. "Actually, I do. This is just one of my accounts. I have several others." The number at the bottom of the statement made Jessica gasp audibly. $3.7 million in that account alone. "You see," I continued, enjoying their stunned expressions, "when your mother died, she left me quite well provided for. Combined with the sale of my business and some wise investments over the years, I've been very comfortable financially." Marcus was staring at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. "But why? Why didn't you tell us?" "Because I wanted to help you without damaging your pride. I thought if I could support you quietly, anonymously, you might find your footing and become truly independent." I pulled out the next batch of papers, bank statements, canceled checks, payment confirmations. "These show every payment I've made on your behalf over the past 3 years. The mortgage that doesn't exist, your car payments, credit cards, insurance, utilities, even your grocery bills. Everything you thought was coming from Marcus's successful business, it was all coming from me." Jessica was hyperventilating now. "This can't be real. Marcus, tell me this isn't real." But Marcus was too busy adding up the numbers in his head. $8,000 a month, he whispered, "for 3 years. That's nearly $300,000, I finished for him. Give or take a few thousand for special occasions and emergencies." Jessica stood up abruptly, her hands shaking. "Why are you telling us this now?" I looked at her directly, letting her see the full weight of my knowledge in my eyes. Because I overheard your conversation with Dr. Martinez about having me committed to Sunset Manor. The color drained completely from her face. You thought I was becoming a burden, I continued. You thought I was confused, maybe developing dementia. You decided that the best solution was to have me declared incompetent and shipped off to an institution. Marcus's head snapped up. Dad, that's not. We weren't. Marcus, I heard every word. Both of you discussing how much money you'd save on groceries and utilities with me gone. Jessica researching facilities and talking to doctors about emergency placement procedures. Jessica sank back onto the sofa, her breathing shallow and rapid. The truly remarkable part, I said, my voice growing colder, is that you were planning to pay for my institutionalization with money that I was providing. You were going to use my own funds to have me locked away. Marcus buried his face in his hands. Oh God. Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I thought... You thought what, son? That your business had suddenly become wildly successful? That you'd magically developed the ability to afford a lifestyle that costs more than most people make in a year? I trusted Jessica, he said weakly. She handles all the finances. I turned to Jessica, who was staring at me with something that looked like hatred. And you, Jessica, you knew we weren't related by blood, so maybe you thought that gave you license to treat me however you wanted, but you forgot something important. What? She whispered. Marcus is my son, and everything I've been giving you, I've been giving because I love him. But love isn't unconditional when it's met with betrayal. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens I'd been maintaining as part of my butler duties. I want both of you to understand something, I said without turning around. Every comfort you've enjoyed, every luxury you've taken for granted, every aspect of the life you've built here, it exists because I allowed it to exist. Jessica found her voice. You can't just cut us off. We have rights. I turned back to face them, and I must have looked different somehow because they both flinched. Rights? I repeated. What rights do you think you have to my money? To my house? To my support? We're family, Marcus said desperately. Are we? I asked. Because family doesn't try to have each other committed to institutions. Family doesn't humiliate each other in front of guests. Family doesn't poison children against their grandparents. Marcus looked confused. What are you talking about? Ask your sister why Emma and Jake are afraid of me now. Ask her what Jessica told them about their grandfather. Jessica's face went white. She'd forgotten about that particular cruelty. You told them I was just an employee, I continued. You convinced them that I was some confused old man who might try to trick them into thinking I was their grandfather. Marcus turned to stare at his wife, horror dawning in his eyes. You said what? I was protecting them, Jessica said weakly. I thought he was becoming unstable. You were isolating me, I corrected, systematically removing me from every relationship that mattered to me. And you, I looked at Marcus. You let her do it. The room fell silent again. Outside, a neighbor was mowing his lawn, the sound of normal suburban life continuing while our family imploded. So here's what's going to happen, I said, returning to my chair. Tomorrow morning, I'm meeting with my lawyer to discuss your living situation. Jessica's breathing became even more labored. You can't throw us out. We'll fight this. With what money? I asked. Your credit cards are maxed out, your bank accounts are empty, and you have no income to speak of. What exactly are you going to fight with? Marcus looked up at me, his eyes red with tears. Dad, please. I know we messed up, but we can fix this. We can make it right. Can you? I asked. Can you give me back the 3 years I spent being treated like hired help in my own home? Can you undo the damage you've done to my relationship with my grandchildren? Can you take back the humiliation of being called just the butler in front of 35 people? He had no answer for that. The saddest part, I said, gathering up my documents, is that all of this could have been avoided. If you'd simply treated me with basic human dignity, if you'd remembered that I was your father instead of your servant, we could have been a real family. I stood to leave, then paused at the doorway. Oh, and Jessica, you might want to call Dr. Martinez and cancel those emergency commitment papers. It turns out I'm not the one who's lost touch with reality. As I walked toward the basement stairs, I could hear Jessica beginning to cry. Not tears of remorse or guilt, but the angry, frustrated sobs of someone whose carefully laid plans had just crumbled around her. Tomorrow, we would discuss the terms of their continued residence in my house. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, they would go to sleep knowing exactly who held all the power. And for the first time in 3 years, I would sleep peacefully. The next morning, I woke up at 6 o'clock as I had every day for the past 3 years. But this time, instead of heading to the kitchen to prepare breakfast for Marcus and Jessica, I made myself a single cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table reading the newspaper. When Jessica came downstairs at 7:30, expecting to find breakfast waiting, she stopped short at the sight of me sitting there with my coffee and paper. "Where's breakfast?" she asked, her voice still hoarse from crying the night before. I looked up from the sports section. "I'm sorry, did you ask me to prepare breakfast?" She blinked, clearly confused. "You always make breakfast." "I always made breakfast when I was pretending to be your butler," I corrected. "But as we established last night, I'm actually the homeowner, and homeowners don't typically cook for their tenants." The word tenants hit her like a slap. Tenants? Well, what would you call people who live in someone else's house without paying rent? Marcus appeared in the doorway, looking like he hadn't slept at all. "Dad, we need to talk." "I agree," I said, folding my newspaper. "Harold will be here at 10 o'clock to discuss your lease agreement." "Lease agreement?" Marcus's voice cracked slightly. "You don't think you can continue living here for free, do you? Not after everything that's happened." Jessica slumped into a chair. "This is insane. Yesterday we were a family, and now you're treating us like strangers." "Yesterday you were planning to have me committed to a psychiatric facility," I replied. "Today we're going to establish some boundaries that should have existed from the beginning." When Harold arrived promptly at 10, he was carrying a briefcase full of legal documents and wearing the expression of a man who thoroughly disapproved of what my family had done to me. "Good morning, Marcus, Jessica," he said formally, setting his briefcase on the dining room table. "I understand we need to clarify some living arrangements." Jessica looked at Marcus desperately, but he seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of their situation. "Let me explain where things stand legally," Harold continued, opening his briefcase. "Kent owns this house outright. You have been living here as guests for 3 years, during which time Kent has also subsidized your entire lifestyle to the tune of nearly $300,000. He pulled out a thick folder. "Unfortunately, there's no legal framework that would require Kent to continue supporting you, especially given recent developments." What recent developments?" Jessica asked, though she clearly dreaded the answer. Harold consulted his notes. "Well, there's the matter of you consulting with Dr. Martinez about having Kent declared mentally incompetent. There's also the systematic alienation of Kent from his grandchildren, and of course, the public humiliation at the Thanksgiving dinner." Marcus winced. "Harold, you have to understand, we didn't know about the financial arrangements. We thought—" "What you thought," Harold interrupted, "is irrelevant to the legal reality. The question now is whether Kent is willing to allow you to continue residing in his home, and if so, under what terms." I leaned back in my chair, studying my son's desperate face. "I've given this a lot of thought," I said. "And I've decided that I'm willing to let you stay, under certain conditions." Relief flooded Marcus's features. "Thank you, Dad. Whatever conditions you want, we'll—" "You haven't heard them yet," I warned. Harold pulled out a lease agreement he'd prepared. "First, you'll be paying market-rate rent for this property. Given the location and square footage, that's $4,500 per month." Jessica gasped. "We can't afford that." "Then you'll need to find somewhere you can afford," I said simply. "Or you'll need to figure out how to increase your income." "Second," Harold continued, "all utilities, groceries, and household expenses are your responsibility. Kent will no longer subsidize any aspect of your lifestyle. Third, you'll be responsible for your own transportation. Kent will reclaim the vehicles he's been paying for." Marcus looked stricken. "Dad, how are we supposed to get to work?" "The same way millions of other people do," I replied. "Buy your own cars, take public transportation, or walk. That's not my problem to solve anymore." "Fourth," Harold continued, "there will be no more attempts to have Kent declared mentally incompetent or committed to any facility. Any such action will result in immediate eviction and potential criminal charges for elder abuse." Jessica's hands were shaking now. "This is extortion." "No," Harold said calmly. "Extortion is what you attempted when you planned to use Kent's institutionalization as leverage to control his assets. This is simply a landlord setting reasonable terms for tenants." "Fifth," I said, taking over from Harold, "Jessica will publicly apologize for her behavior at Thanksgiving. Not just to me, but to everyone who witnessed it." Jessica's face went red. "I won't humiliate myself just to satisfy your ego." "Then you won't be living here anymore," I said. "It's your choice." "Sixth," Harold continued, Contact with the grandchildren will be restored immediately. Jessica will call Linda today and explain that there was a misunderstanding about Kent's role in the family. And finally, I said, standing up, I want to make something absolutely clear. I am not your butler, your employee, or your servant. I am the owner of this house and Marcus's father. You will treat me with the respect that both of those positions deserve, or you will find somewhere else to live. The room was silent for a long moment. Jessica was crying again, but this time they were tears of rage and frustration rather than sadness. How long do we have to decide? Marcus asked quietly. The lease starts today, Harold said. First month's rent is due immediately, along with a security deposit of $4,500, so you'll need $9,000 by close of business today. Jessica laughed bitterly. We don't have $9,000. We don't have $900. Then I suggest you start making some phone calls, I said. Maybe Jessica's parents would be willing to help. Or you could sell some of those expensive clothes and jewelry you've accumulated over the past 3 years. Marcus looked at me pleadingly. Dad, surely we can work out some kind of payment plan. Son, I've been your payment plan for 3 years. It's time for you to stand on your own. Harold closed his briefcase. I'll give you 24 hours to come up with the money and sign the lease. If you can't meet those terms, Kent will begin eviction proceedings. After Harold left, I went upstairs to pack my belongings. I was moving out of the basement and into the master bedroom where I belonged. Marcus and Jessica could have the basement if they wanted to stay. As I was folding clothes, Marcus appeared in the doorway. Dad, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I'm sorry. I know that's not enough, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and supported, and tried to find some trace of the boy he used to be. Are you sorry because you finally understand what you did to me? I asked. Or are you sorry because you got caught? He was quiet for a long moment. Both, I think, but mostly the first one. And Jessica? Is she sorry too? Marcus's shoulders sagged. Jessica is angry. She thinks you've been manipulating us, setting us up for this moment. What do you think? I think, Marcus said slowly, I think I stopped seeing you as my father somewhere along the way. I let Jessica convince me that you were just, I don't know, a burden we had to manage. And I'm ashamed of that. It was more honesty than I'd heard from him in years. What about the institutionalization plan? I asked. Were you really going to let her have me committed? Marcus's face crumpled. I was scared, Dad. Jessica said you were getting worse, that you might hurt yourself or someone else. I thought I was protecting you. By locking me away? I see how wrong that was now. I see how wrong all of it was. I finished packing my clothes and turned to face him fully. Marcus, I want to believe that you're genuinely sorry, but apologies without change are just words. What do you want me to do? I want you to choose, I said, between the life Jessica has convinced you that you deserve and the family you actually have, because you can't have both anymore. 3 hours later, I watched from the living room window as Jessica loaded suitcases into a taxi. She'd called her parents, who agreed to let her come home while she figured things out. The public apology I'd demanded was apparently a bridge too far for her. Marcus stayed. He signed the lease, borrowed money from his sister Linda for the first month's rent and deposit, and moved his belongings to the basement bedroom I'd vacated. That evening, we sat in the kitchen together for the first time in 3 years, not as homeowner and butler, but as father and son. I don't know if I can afford to keep living here long term, Marcus admitted. $4,500 a month is more than my business actually brings in, and then you'll need to build a real business, I said. Not one that exists only in Jessica's imagination. He nodded. I've already started. I have 3 legitimate clients and I'm working on getting more. Good. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of us adjusting to this new dynamic. Dad? Marcus said finally. Yeah? Would it be okay if I called Linda and asked her to bring the kids over this weekend? I think there are some things I need to explain to them about their grandfather. I smiled for the first time in months. I'd like that very much. 6 months later, Marcus had built his consulting business into something genuinely profitable. He was paying his rent on time, covering his own expenses, and slowly rebuilding the relationship he'd damaged with his children. Jessica had filed for divorce and was living with her parents in another state. According to Linda, she was telling everyone who would listen that I was a manipulative old man who had destroyed her marriage out of spite. Maybe she was right about the destruction part, but sometimes things have to be torn down completely before they can be rebuilt properly. The house felt like home again. Marcus and I had dinner together most evenings, and Emma and Jake visited every other weekend. They'd gotten over their fear of me quickly once Marcus explained that their grandfather wasn't a confused employee, but actually the man who owned the house and loved them very much. I never went back to being their butler. Instead, I took my place as the patriarch of the family, the role I should have claimed from the beginning. And while the financial support I provided was much more limited than before, it was given freely and with full knowledge of what it represented. The best part was watching Marcus grow into the man I'd always known he could be. Stripped of Jessica's manipulation and forced to stand on his own, he'd found strength and dignity I hadn't seen in him for years. Some people might say I was too harsh, that I should have simply forgiven and forgotten, but respect isn't something you can give yourself. It has to be earned. And sometimes the people who love you most need to learn the hardest lessons. I'd spent 3 years being invisible in my own home. Now, finally, I was exactly where I belonged.